Picture, if you will, two completely opposite concepts. On one hand, we have the classic fantasy dungeon, a terrifying subterranean labyrinth filled with deadly traps, bottomless pits, and horrifying monsters lurking in the shadows, waiting to tear any foolish adventurer limb from limb. It is a place of death, glory, and unimaginable danger. On the other hand, we have the concept of childhood friends, a bond forged in the innocent days of early youth, built on shared secrets, scraped knees on the playground, and a connection that spans years of growing up together side by side. It is a relationship so pure and deeply rooted that, in its own way, it feels like a beautiful fantasy. Now, what happens when these two entirely different worlds violently collide? Let me tell you the story of a very unusual reunion. Deep within the bowels of a notoriously dangerous dungeon, the air was thick with the scent of dust and danger. A horde of terrifying creatures, a massive minotaur wielding a spiked club, a vicious orc, a snarling werewolf, and a screeching harpy charged down a stone corridor. They were the dungeon's formidable vanguard, bringing death to all who dared trespass. But today, they were the ones being pushed back. Standing against this tide of monsters was Van. He was a 17-year-old human swordsman, dressed in standard adventurer gear, his blade flashing in the dim torchlight. For a specific, deeply personal goal, this young man had ventured into the very depths of the dungeon. With a swift, powerful strike, he sent the monsters flying. The minotaur crashed into the stone wall, groaning in defeat as it slumped to the floor. Van, breathing heavily and wiping sweat from his brow, sheathed his sword. He looked down at the battered minotaur, who could only stammer out that the human was permitted to pass, warning him that the king of the dungeon was waiting. Van stepped past the defeated guards and approached the massive, heavy stone doors that marked the deepest chamber. He pushed them open, stepping into a cavernous, awe-inspiring room. Piles of gold and sparkling crystals lined the walls, but all of that was dwarfed by the creature sitting in the center of the room. It was the Black Dragon King, Obsidian. The dragon was a nightmare of scales, horns, and leathery wings, looming over the boy like a mountain of pure destruction. The dragon spread its massive wings, kicking up a gale of wind, and glared down at Van with piercing reptilian eyes. Its voice boomed, echoing off the stone walls with a regal, ancient cadence. It praised the human for making it this far and declared, with absolute authority, that it would be his final opponent. Van stood there, a tiny figure in the shadow of the beast. He was sweating profusely. Drops of moisture beaded on his forehead, his face twisted in a look of extreme discomfort. He didn't raise his sword. He didn't speak. He just stood there, looking incredibly pained. The Black Dragon King paused. The intimidating aura faltered for a second. The dragon leaned in closer, its terrifying visage suddenly looking very confused and slightly panicked. Dropping the ancient, booming voice entirely, the dragon sounded remarkably like a concerned teenager. It nervously pointed out that Van was sweating buckets and begged him not to just stand there in silence. The grand illusion shattered completely when Van finally spoke, not with a heroic battle cry, but with a tired sigh. He complained that the outside of the dungeon was incredibly hot today, being the middle of summer, and casually asked if the terrifying Black Dragon King could use its giant wings to fan him and cool him down. The dragon, completely exasperated, let out a defeated sigh and gently flapped its massive wings, sending a cool, refreshing breeze over the sweaty swordsman. Van stretched his arms out, letting out a satisfied groan as the cool air hit him. Looking up at the beast, Van asked why she was in her dragon form anyway, and what was up with that weird, theatrical roleplay speech she was doing. The dragon nervously looked away, a bead of sweat forming on its scaly brow. She mumbled that they hadn't seen each other in a while, so she just wanted to surprise him for a bit. Feeling embarrassed that her grand entrance was a total flop, she threw a minor tantrum, complaining that Van was no fun at all. In a flash of magical light, the massive Black Dragon King shrank down, the scales and wings dissolving until a young girl stood in its place. She had bright, cheerful eyes, a pair of curved dragon horns resting on her head, pointy ears, and a thick reptilian tail swaying behind her shorts and casual tunic. This was Ryuka. The strongest boss in the dungeon, the terrifying Black Dragon King, was actually Van's childhood friend. The atmosphere in the boss room immediately shifted from a life-or-death struggle to a casual weekend hangout, Ryuka happily waved at Van, welcoming him. Van reached into a plastic grocery bag he had been carrying this whole time and pulled out a bundle of fresh vegetables, offering them to her with a note that they were a gift from his mother. Ryuka's face scrunched up in childish distaste. She whined about having to eat vegetables again, reminding him that she was a dragon and preferred meat. Van, entirely unfazed, gave her a deadpan look and reminded her that even their pet turtles back home ate their veggies for nutritional balance. Defeated by the logic, and secretly touched that it was a gift from Van's mother, Ryuka accepted the bag, quietly muttering that she would eat them. Van then pulled out a couple of wooden mugs filled with a milky, sweet beverage he brought from the surface, offering her a drink. They sat down together on a soft cushion right there in the middle of the dungeon floor. It was a bizarre and beautifully domestic scene. The young man, the only person to ever conquer this dungeon, and the dungeon's king, the strongest black dragon, were now just two kids sitting side by side, sipping sweet drinks and reading manga. Van casually brought up a grievance, taking a sip from his mug. He complained that every single time he came to visit her, her subordinates always attacked him. He asked if she could do something about it, because he genuinely felt sorry for having to beat them up every time he walked through the front door. Meanwhile, just outside the heavy doors of the boss chamber, a truly pathetic scene was unfolding. The Minotaur, the Orc, the Werewolf, and the Harpy, the very monsters Van had effortlessly crushed moments ago, were huddled together, peeking through a crack in the door. They were covered in bandages, bumps, and bruises. Hearing Van's complaint, they quietly whispered among themselves. They knew Van was their king's precious friend, and they knew it was rude to attack him. But as the Minotaur tearfully explained, they were dungeon monsters. It was their literal job to ward off anyone who entered the dungeon. They couldn't just let him walk in, even if they knew they were going to lose. They also knew the sad truth of the situation. Van's house on the surface was very far away, meaning these two childhood friends, who had known each other for 10 years, could only afford to meet once a month. Watching Van and Ryuka laugh together inside the room, the battered monsters felt a collective warmth in their hearts. They wiped away tears of joy, completely captivated by how wholesome and pure the two youths looked. The Minotaur sighed dreamily, reminiscing about the beauty of youth and childhood friends, completely forgetting the severe physical trauma they had just endured. But inside the room, the mood suddenly took a dip. Van looked at the time and announced that he needed to get going. He had a lot of things to do today. Ryuka's smile fell. She looked down at the board game she had eagerly prepared for them to play, a disappointed pout on her lips. She tried to hide her sadness, muttering that if he had to go, it couldn't be helped, and sadly noted that she would just have to wait until next month to see him again. The monsters outside silently panicked, mentally screaming at Van to stay longer, to flirt more, to maybe even spend the night. Seeing Ryuka's drooping dragon tail, Van smiled warmly. He realized he had forgotten to tell her the most important news. He stopped her and casually mentioned that they could just play the game tomorrow. Ryuka blinked, completely caught off guard. Tomorrow? Why would he be here tomorrow? Van grinned and explained that he had officially joined the Adventurers Guild in the human town, located right at the base of her dungeon. Starting today, he was living there. He told her that becoming an adventurer had always been his dream, and he figured, why not do it right here? The implication hung in the air. The monsters outside gasped in unison. That meant Van could visit every single day. Ryuka's eyes widened, a mischievous, teasing smile spreading across her face. She leaned in close to Van, puffing a little bit of proud dragon smoke from her nose. She smugly asked if he had decided to move all the way out here just because he wanted to see her every day. She teased him, asking if he was just too lonely without her. She expected him to get flustered, to deny it, to act tough. Instead, Van looked right back at her, his expression completely soft and deeply sincere. Without a single ounce of hesitation, he said, "Yeah, honestly, very." The absolute honesty was a critical hit. Ryuka's smug expression instantly melted into a bright, burning blush. She gripped the fabric of her shirt, completely speechless, her heart pounding in her chest. Unable to form a witty comeback to such a direct confession, she simply looked away, her face red all the way to the tips of her pointed ears. Van, satisfied, waved goodbye and promised to see her tomorrow. Ryuka could only offer a weak, breathless goodbye in return. After Van left, Ryuka stood alone in the boss chamber, holding her flushed cheeks in her hands, a bright, overwhelmingly happy smile on her face. Her tail wagged happily behind her. Outside the door, the monsters were practically vibrating with excitement. The sheer cuteness of the interaction was almost too much for them to handle. The Minotaur leader, his eyes burning with renewed passion and a terrifying resolve, turned to his bruised and battered comrades. He raised his massive fist in the air. He declared that tomorrow was going to be a very busy day. They were going to do everything in their power to support these two childhood friends and their blossoming romance. The monsters cheered in unison, their spirits soaring. They knew exactly what this meant. If Van was going to visit every single day to see Ryuka, then as the dedicated guardians of the dungeon, they would have to fulfill their duties and try to stop him every single day. They proudly accepted their fate. They would bear the physical wounds. They would gladly be beaten to a bloody pulp on a daily basis, all for the sake of true love. Though, as the harpy quickly muttered, the Minotaur was definitely just enjoying the pain a little too much. And so begins the daily, violent, and incredibly heartwarming routine of the dungeon's most terrifying boss and her unstoppable childhood friend.